The car's headlights cut through the night as the officer's vehicle rolled to a slow stop behind the sleek black sedan. His hand hovered over the radio, the usual ritual before engaging with a civilian. But tonight, something felt different. He hadn't expected this. Not at all. The officer stepped out, the night air crisp against his uniform. His boots hit the pavement with an air of authority as he made his way toward the driver's side of the sedan. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sleek car, immediately drawing assumptions about its owner. He knocked sharply on the window. The window rolled down slowly, revealing the driver, tall, composed, his uniform bearing the insignia of a police captain. The officer blinked, surprised but unwilling to show it. "License and registration," he barked, his tone dismissive. The captain didn't flinch. He simply stared at the officer, his eyes calm, but sharp. "I know why you pulled me over," the captain said, his voice steady. "And I'm not interested in your reasons." The officer's brow furrowed. "Excuse me, sir. Are you implying, I know what you see when you look at me?" the captain interrupted, his gaze unbroken. "You see a black man in a uniform, and it makes you uneasy, doesn't it? The power, the position, the authority. All of it conflicts with what you've been taught to believe." The officer hesitated, caught off guard by the captain's words. His hand hovered near his gun, a gut reaction, one he quickly buried, ashamed of the impulse. The silence between them stretched. "You pulled me over because you're afraid," the captain continued, leaning slightly forward. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of truth. "Afraid that someone like me could be your equal, maybe even your superior." The officer's mind raced. Was he truly being confronted by this man? The very personification of the world he had fought so hard to ignore? It didn't make sense. He had always followed the rules, hadn't he? Yet this moment felt different. His pulse quickened, unease clawing at him. The captain's eyes remained locked on his, not with anger, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had seen too much, someone who had fought his own battles that hadn't been about rank or power, but about survival. The officer stood frozen, unable to find his voice. The words he wanted to speak were lost in the pit of his stomach. "I'm not the enemy here," the captain said, breaking the silence at last. "But you are." There it was. The challenge. The moment of truth. The officer had to respond. The weight of the words hung in the air like an invisible thread, pulling at him. Would he fight back, cling to his biases, or would he confront his own darkness? But before the officer could speak, the captain spoke again, his tone unyielding. "It's time you learned something about the world you've built in your mind. It's time you realize what you've been taught isn't the truth." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. The captain had already said it all. The silence between them deepened, both men standing in the quiet of the night, facing each other across a chasm of judgment, pride, and fear. But for the first time, there was an undeniable shift, a challenge not just of authority, but of what it meant to be a man in a world full of prejudice. In that moment, the officer realized he wasn't just standing before a man in a uniform. He was standing before a mirror, reflecting the parts of himself he had refused to see. And that was when it hit him, the uncomfortable truth of it all. The officer took a step back, his mind racing, but he couldn't break eye contact. This was not a routine traffic stop. This was a confrontation. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm on the horizon, ready to explode. The captain's steady gaze bore into him, challenging everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and control. "You think you can just speak to me like that?" the officer finally stammered, his voice shaky but tinged with defiance. "You think I don't know what I'm doing? I'm a cop, same as you." The captain didn't flinch. "You're not the same as me," he said, his tone unwavering. "You're the one who thinks you have the right to judge me, to control me. But that's not how it works. Not anymore. The officer's chest tightened. He had always believed he was in control, that his badge was a shield that protected him from challenges, from anyone questioning his authority. But this man, this black police captain, was flipping that shield around, showing him how fragile it really was. "You're not in charge here," the officer snapped, the anger in his voice rising. He reached for his ticket book, the familiarity of the action giving him a momentary sense of power. "You're going to get a ticket. And I'm going to report you for being insubordinate." The captain didn't move. He didn't even glance at the officer's ticket book. Instead, he stepped forward, his presence like a wall the officer couldn't get around. "You can give me a ticket," the captain said, his voice cold, "but it won't change anything. Not about you. Not about me." The officer's hand wavered over the book, uncertainty flooding his mind. Something about this moment felt wrong, so much more than just a traffic stop. The words he wanted to say were stuck in his throat, buried under layers of bias, anger, and confusion. He didn't want to admit it, but the captain's calmness unnerved him. The very fact that this man stood before him, unshaken and resolute, made him question his own sense of superiority. "Why are you doing this?" the officer finally muttered, his voice quieter now, almost defeated. "Why are you making this so complicated?" The captain's gaze softened for a brief moment. "Because it's not complicated for you," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "You've never had to question whether you belong in this uniform. But I have. Every single day. I've had to prove myself in ways you can't even imagine." The officer blinked, taken aback. He wasn't prepared for this kind of honesty. His whole life had been about rules, about right and wrong. But what the captain was saying wasn't about rules, it was about something deeper. It was about how people saw each other, how they judged each other based on skin color, based on assumptions that were ingrained in them before they ever wore a badge. The officer's grip on the ticket book loosened as the weight of the captain's words settled in. He had always told himself that he was just doing his job, that this was about order, discipline, and respect. But now, standing before this man, this black man in a position of power, he began to see that it was about much more than that. It was about who had the right to define what was fair, what was just, and what was deserved. "I don't want trouble," the officer muttered, his voice wavering. "And neither do I," the captain replied calmly. "But trouble doesn't just show up on its own. We create it. With every decision we make, every assumption we allow ourselves to hold on to, we create the problems we try so hard to avoid." The officer swallowed hard, realizing that the captain wasn't just talking about this moment, about this traffic stop. He was talking about something far bigger. About a system that had failed, that had allowed men like him to make decisions based on preconceived notions, on hate and fear, instead of seeing people for who they really were. The captain took another step forward, not in anger, but with purpose. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "But you have to learn. You have to open your mind and your heart if you want to change. This doesn't end here." The officer stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The air around him felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 questions pressing down on him. He had always thought he understood the world, he had always thought he knew what was right and wrong. But now, faced with this man, this captain, he realized that everything he had believed was being questioned. Everything he had ever taken for granted was now in doubt. And that scared him more than anything else. The officer didn't move for a long time. His eyes were locked on the captain's, but his mind was elsewhere, wandering back to a time when things seemed simpler, when everything he believed had been easier to understand. He could feel the captain's gaze, steady and unyielding, but something deeper was stirring inside him, something he hadn't expected. Doubt. The captain shifted, his tone softer now, as though sensing the officer's inner conflict. "You think this is about me and you," he said, his voice almost gentle. But it's not. This is about a system. A way of thinking that's been built up over years, over generations. It's about the belief that some people deserve more than others. The officer looked away, the words hitting too close to home. He had grown up in a world where certain people were seen as better, as more deserving of respect and authority. Where those who looked like the captain were often dismissed, marginalized, or even feared. He had learned early on that there were lines drawn in society, in history, in the way people interacted with one another. But the captain was right. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything that had led him here. The officer shifted on his feet, his hands now trembling slightly as he reached for his radio, but stopped midway. The weight of the moment stopped him. Instead, he found himself thinking back to his own past. His childhood, the stories he had heard growing up, the way his parents had spoken about people who weren't like him. The assumptions that had been ingrained in him long before he ever put on the uniform. His father had been a cop too, and his mother had always been proud of the family tradition. "We stand for justice," she'd said, "for what's right." The officer had heard those words so many times, but he never questioned what justice meant. He never wondered why certain people were always on the other side of it. "Do you know what it's like," the captain continued, his voice cutting through the officer's memories, "to be judged for the color of your skin before you even open your mouth? To be judged before you've even had the chance to show who you are? It's a feeling you can't understand unless you've lived it." The officer swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He had never lived it. He had never known what it was like to be judged on something so uncontrollable, something so deeply personal. He had never had to fight for the right to exist in a world that was stacked against him, just because of the color of his skin. The captain was still speaking, but the officer couldn't focus on his words. He was lost in the memories of his past, in the lessons he had learned, in the way those lessons had shaped him. The officer's mind drifted back to a conversation he had had with his father just a few years ago. His father, a proud, seasoned cop, had told him that the world would always be divided, that there would always be people who needed to be controlled, people who didn't deserve to have a voice. "Remember your place," his father had said. "The law is the law. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's about keeping order." The officer had believed him. But now, as he stood here, face to face with the captain, he wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure about anything. The captain noticed the officer's silence. "You don't have to keep living like this," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to stay locked in that mindset. There's a world out there where you can be better, where you can be the change you want to see. But it starts with questioning everything you've been taught." The officer's breath caught in his throat. He had always prided himself on doing what was right, on following the rules. But what if those rules weren't enough? What if the world wasn't as simple as black and white, right and wrong? "Have you ever wondered why you're so certain about everything?" the captain asked, his tone still calm but probing, like a surgeon peeling back layers to reveal the truth. "Have you ever wondered why you feel like you're always in control, always right?" The officer looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. And in that moment, the captain's question didn't just resonate, it shattered something inside him. The officer had always thought that control was power, that knowing the rules was enough. But now, he wasn't so sure. The captain's eyes softened, a hint of sadness in them. "It's not too late," he said quietly. "You can change. You can break free from this cycle." The officer felt a pang in his chest, a knot of confusion tightening in his stomach. He had always believed that his actions were justified, that his position gave him the right to hold power over others. But now, the more he listened to the captain, the more he realized how deep those biases ran, how much of his life had been shaped by forces beyond his control. The captain stepped back slightly, giving the officer space to think. He wasn't trying to push him, he was simply offering him a chance. The officer didn't know what to do with that chance yet, but he could feel something stirring inside him, something that told him this moment was important. This encounter was more than just a confrontation, it was a turning point. And as the silence stretched between them, the officer found himself wondering if he could ever look at the world the same way again. The officer stood in the silence, his thoughts racing. He felt the weight of the captain's words pressing down on him, pulling him into a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time, he wasn't sure who he was or what he stood for. He had always believed he was right, after all, he was the one with the badge, the authority. But now, standing here, facing this man who had been nothing but calm and composed, everything felt different. The captain remained still, his posture unwavering. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's rising confusion and anger. But the captain didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He knew the power of self-assurance, the quiet authority that didn't need to shout or demand respect. It simply commanded it. "You're not in control here," the captain said again, his voice calm but firm. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The officer could feel the sting of them. He had always been the one in charge, he had always thought he was the one people respected. But now, with the captain standing before him, there was a shift in the balance. The captain's presence was magnetic, drawing the officer in and forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about authority. The officer opened his mouth, ready to protest, but the captain held up a hand, silencing him before he could speak. "You're not in charge because you wear a badge," the captain continued, his voice steady. "You're in charge when you earn respect. When you show people you're worthy of it." The officer's mind raced. What did that even mean? How could he show respect when everything in him was telling him to fight back? This was not how things were supposed to go. Cops didn't question other cops, especially not when they had the upper hand. They didn't stand there, unsure of what to say next. But with the captain's words still echoing in his mind, the officer was beginning to question his own understanding of power. "You think respect is something you can force," the captain continued. "You think authority is a badge, a uniform. But real authority comes from within. It comes from understanding people, from listening to them, from leading by example, not by force." The officer's jaw tightened. He had always led by force. He had always thought that his role as an enforcer of the law meant that he had to be the one who made the rules, who told people what to do. But now, facing this man who spoke with such quiet strength, he was beginning to wonder if he had been wrong all along. "I didn't become a cop to make friends," the officer muttered, his voice low. "I became one to protect people." "And you're still protecting people," the captain said, his voice soothing. "But you're not just protecting them from harm. You're protecting them from judgment. You're protecting them from a system that has already decided who they are based on where they come from, what they look like." The officer flinched, the words cutting deep. He had always believed that he was doing what was right, that he was fighting for justice. But now, with the captain's words settling in, he wondered if he had been blinded by his own sense of righteousness. The captain's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "You want respect, don't you? You want to be someone people look up to, someone who stands for something more than just the badge on his chest." The officer nodded slowly. He had always wanted respect, always believed that his position would command it. But now, standing before this captain, he realized that respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, and it had to come from understanding. The captain took another step forward, his presence like a shield, not to intimidate, but to protect. "Respect isn't about forcing your will on others," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's about understanding where others are coming from, seeing them as human beings, not just as suspects or criminals or even fellow officers. It's about recognizing that we all have our struggles, our stories. And when you listen to those stories, you'll earn the respect you seek." The officer was silent. The captain's words were seeping into him, sinking deep into the places he hadn't even realized were still closed off. For so long, he had been locked into a world where authority and control were everything. But now, standing here with the captain, he was beginning to understand that true power didn't come from dominance. It came from connection. From empathy. "I don't know how to fix it," the officer whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix myself." The captain's expression softened, a small but reassuring smile tugging at his lips. "You don't need to fix anything. You just need to be willing to change. To open your eyes and see the world as it is, not as you've been taught to see it. And once you do that, once you start understanding people, you'll realize that everything you've ever wanted was already inside of you." The officer took a deep breath, his mind spinning with the captain's words. He had spent so much of his life thinking that being right was enough. But now, he was beginning to see that being right wasn't the point. The point was to grow. To learn. To see people not as obstacles to be overcome, but as individuals worthy of respect, no matter their background or appearance. And in that moment, the officer realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life: real authority didn't come from power. It came from compassion. The officer's mind was reeling. The captain's words, like echoes in the quiet of the night, swirled around him, refusing to leave. He could feel them pressing against the walls he had built around his heart, walls made of pride, fear, and unchallenged beliefs. The captain had shattered those walls with every sentence, and now, with nothing left to hide behind, the officer had to face the truth he had avoided for so long. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the very moment was holding its breath. The officer couldn't stop his hands from shaking. His mind kept returning to the captain's words: "You're not in control here. Real authority comes from within." What did that even mean for him? What did it mean for everything he had been taught? Suddenly, the sound of a car door opening shattered the stillness. Both men turned sharply, their eyes instantly shifting to the scene unfolding across the street. A woman was standing near a parked car, her hand raised as if to wave. She seemed to be calling someone, but there was something wrong. Her eyes were frantic, and her body language was tense, as though something was off. Without thinking, the officer's training kicked in. He started moving toward her, but the captain stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Wait," the captain said, his voice calm but firm. The officer froze, momentarily thrown off balance by the captain's sudden movement. "What's going on?" the officer asked, his instincts taking over. The captain didn't answer immediately. He watched the woman carefully, his gaze sharp. "There's something more going on here," he said quietly. "This isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about understanding the bigger picture." The officer's confusion deepened. What did the captain mean? Was this some sort of test? Was this all a part of the lesson he had been trying to impart? Before the officer could speak again, the woman's voice carried across the street, frantic and desperate. "Help! Help me, please," she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. They're taking him." The officer's heart raced. His eyes darted to the car. He saw a shadow moving inside, a struggle unfolding just beyond the tinted windows. Without thinking, he sprinted forward, but the captain grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "No," the captain said sharply. "You don't get to make that decision just yet. Not until you see the truth." The officer was torn, his mind screaming to help the woman, to jump into action like he had been trained to do. But the captain's grip on his arm was steady, unyielding. There was something in the captain's eyes now, something the officer had never seen before. It was as if the captain wasn't just holding him back physically. He was holding him back from making the same mistakes, from rushing in without understanding. "Look closely," the captain said, his voice quieter now, but with an undeniable edge. "What's happening here isn't what it seems. You need to see beyond the surface." The officer looked at the car, his eyes narrowing. The struggle inside had stopped, and a few moments later, the door opened. A figure stepped out, another officer. The officer was tall, broad-shouldered, with a hardened expression that the officer immediately recognized. It was one of his own, a fellow cop who had worked with him for years. The woman's pleas grew more frantic as she rushed toward the officer, her hands outstretched. But the officer didn't respond. He just stood there, his face hard, as if he hadn't heard her at all. The scene unfolded before the officer's eyes, and for the first time, he began to see something he hadn't seen before. The officer wasn't helping her. He wasn't trying to calm the situation. Instead, he seemed to be dismissing her completely, as if she were a mere nuisance. The officer's stomach twisted. This was not what he had expected. It wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. It was something far darker. The captain's grip on the officer loosened, but he didn't let go. "This is what you need to understand," the captain said, his voice low. "This is the system. This is the reality that you, and so many others, are a part of. You're standing on the other side of this. And the question is, are you going to keep turning a blind eye?" The officer's breath caught in his throat as he watched the other cop walk away, leaving the woman standing there, helpless. His mind reeled. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, was falling apart before him. He had always thought he was on the right side. But this was not justice. This was abuse of power. This was a system that turned its back on those who needed help the most. The captain's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. The officer's heart pounded in his chest. He had always been part of the system. But now, for the first time, he could see it for what it truly was. "You can't fix this with a ticket or a badge," the captain said softly, but with undeniable conviction. "You have to be willing to change it. To stand up against it, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's your own." The officer's hands clenched into fists as the weight of the captain's words sank in. The struggle inside him intensified. For so long, he had believed that he was doing his job, that he was upholding the law. But now, standing here with the captain, he realized that his role wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the law. It was about understanding people, and seeing them for who they really were. And in that moment, the officer made a choice. A choice to stop ignoring the truth. To stop turning away when injustice was staring him in the face. He looked at the captain, his expression resolute. "I can't just stand by anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't ignore this." The captain gave him a small, approving nod. "Then you're already on the right path." The officer's mind was buzzing with a mixture of confusion and determination. The world he had once known seemed to have unraveled before him. The captain's words echoed in his mind, "You have to see beyond the surface." The woman's desperate cries for help, the officer's cold indifference, the realization that his own colleague was part of a system that perpetuated the very injustice he had sworn to protect people from, it was all too much. But it was also clarity. For years, the officer had lived his life by a set of rules. His father had instilled in him the idea that the law was absolute, that it was his duty to uphold it no matter what. "The law is the law," his father would say. "You don't ask questions, you just enforce it." But now, standing beside the captain, the officer understood something his father never had: the law was only as good as the people who enforced it, and when those people were blind to the humanity of those they served, the law became something much darker. The officer turned to face the captain, his expression hardening with resolve. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of everything he had just witnessed. The captain's face softened, but his eyes were sharp. "We start by speaking the truth. We don't hide from what we've seen. We don't pretend like it's not happening, because it is. We fight for justice, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary." The officer nodded, his chest tight with the enormity of the decision. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He had spent his entire life turning a blind eye to the uncomfortable truths, ignoring the cracks in the system that were too painful to face. But now, those cracks were wide open, and he couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't ignore the injustice any longer. As they turned toward the scene, the officer saw the woman, still standing by the car, her eyes pleading for help. The officer took a step toward her, but this time, his heart wasn't clouded by the same uncertainty. He had a purpose now, a reason to act. "We can't let this go on," the officer muttered to himself. "Not anymore." He approached the woman carefully, his posture different now, softer, more compassionate. He had always thought he had been helping people, keeping them safe, but it wasn't until now that he truly understood what that meant. Safety wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about protecting people's dignity, their humanity. "Are you okay?" the officer asked gently, his voice no longer authoritative but genuine. The woman's eyes flickered with hesitation, but she nodded, grateful for the change in his tone. She began, her voice trembling, "They took my husband. He's just been trying to get home. We've been stopped before, but this time, it's different. They won't listen." The officer looked back at the other cop, who had walked off without a care in the world, leaving the woman abandoned. His stomach turned, and a knot of guilt twisted in his chest. This was the moment where everything could change. He had a choice to make. Without saying another word, the officer reached for his radio, his hands now steady and sure. The captain stood beside him, watching silently, waiting for him to take the lead. He didn't need to say anything. The officer knew what to do now. "This is Officer 3745, he said into the radio. "Requesting backup at the corner of Elm and 5th, suspected abuse of authority. We need a full review of the situation here. I repeat, we need a full review." The words felt heavy coming out of his mouth. He had never once questioned his colleagues like this before. But now, with the captain beside him, he realized that doing the right thing was more important than protecting a system that was broken. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a person who had to stand up for what was right, even if it meant challenging everything he had known. The radio crackled in response. "Roger that, Officer 3745. Backup is en route." The officer breathed a sigh of relief, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "I'm going to make sure he's safe," the officer said, his eyes meeting the captain's. The captain gave him a small nod, and together, they approached the car where the other officer was standing. The officer's heart pounded in his chest. He was walking into uncharted territory now, territory that was bound to shake things up. As they got closer, the other officer turned to face them, his posture stiff and defensive. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice no longer uncertain, but demanding. "This doesn't concern you," the other cop said, his tone cold and dismissive. But the officer could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He wasn't used to being questioned. "Yes, it does," the officer replied firmly. "This is about more than just you and me. This is about doing what's right." For the first time, the other officer hesitated. His eyes darted between the captain and the officer, and for a brief moment, the officer saw something shift in him, something resembling fear. The officer didn't know if it was the presence of the captain, his newfound resolve, or the simple truth of the situation, but the shift was undeniable. "You can't just," the officer started to protest, but the words caught in his throat when the sound of sirens approached in the distance. Backup was on its way. And for the first time, the officer felt like he wasn't standing alone. The tension in the air thickened, but now, the officer was ready to face whatever came next. He had made his choice. He had taken the first step toward making things right. And he wasn't going to back down. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The officer could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the anticipation of what was to come settling heavily in the pit of his stomach. The moment of truth was fast approaching. He was no longer just following orders, he was doing what he believed was right. And in this moment, that was everything. The other officer stood frozen, watching him with a mix of anger and confusion. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, not by someone in his own force. But the officer wasn't backing down now. Not after everything he had witnessed, not after everything the captain had shown him. "You don't understand what you're doing," the other officer spat, trying to maintain control of the situation. His voice was strained, but there was a noticeable crack in his facade, an underlying panic. "I understand perfectly," the officer replied, his voice steady and calm. "This is about doing what's right, not what's easy. You can't just ignore the system because it's convenient. You can't keep standing by and letting people get hurt." The officer's words hung in the air like a challenge, but the other cop wasn't ready to admit defeat. He shifted his weight, his fingers twitching, and the officer could see the anger rising in him once again. "You're going to regret this," the other cop threatened, stepping forward in a menacing way. The officer stood firm, unwavering. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had faced the truth, and that was stronger than any threat. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "I won't regret doing what's right. But you will. You'll regret ignoring the truth when it's too late." The captain, standing by his side, didn't move, but his presence was a silent pillar of strength. The officer could feel the captain's steady gaze, his support unwavering. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. There was someone else who saw the world the way he did now. Someone who understood what it meant to stand up, even when the odds were against you. Just as the tension between the two officers seemed to reach its peak, the sirens grew louder. Backup had arrived. The officer's gaze flicked to the approaching vehicles, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Several more officers poured out of the cars, and for the first time, the officer felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't facing this alone anymore. One of the backup officers, a woman in her late 30s, approached them cautiously, her eyes scanning the situation. She looked at the officer first, then at the captain, and finally at the officer who had been acting with hostility. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but assertive. The officer didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, explaining the situation succinctly, keeping his voice steady and clear. "There was an incident. This officer was involved in using excessive force, and the woman was unlawfully detained. I've already called for a full review of the situation. We're not letting this go." The woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She glanced at the other officer, who was now visibly sweating, the facade of confidence slipping away. His eyes darted around, trying to gauge the reactions of the backup officers, but it was clear he knew he was losing control of the situation. "We need to make sure this is handled appropriately," the woman said, her voice firm, but calm. She looked directly at the officer who had been the source of tension, and her gaze was filled with a quiet determination. "You'll be placed on leave pending a full investigation. We'll review the incident and make sure everything is handled properly." The officer who had been antagonizing the woman opened his mouth to argue, but the woman raised a hand, cutting him off. "No," she said simply. "It's over. This situation needs to be handled by the book. You'll be held accountable for your actions, just like everyone else." The officer's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The weight of the moment seemed to hit him all at once. The other officers began to take control of the scene, securing the woman's safety and making sure everything was documented. The captain stood beside the officer, watching everything unfold. For the first time in what felt like forever, the officer felt a sense of peace. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. He had done what was right. He had made the choice to speak up, to stand up for the truth, and to do what he had never done before, question the system, even when it meant risking everything he thought he knew. "You did the right thing," the captain said softly, his voice carrying a hint of pride. The officer turned to him, grateful for his guidance. "I didn't know if I could," the officer replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't." The captain gave a slight nod, his expression one of quiet approval. "Sometimes, that's all it takes. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to change, to see the world for what it really is. And then, you do what you can to make it better." As the backup officers continued to handle the situation, the officer stood by the captain, watching the woman get the help she needed. The city around them seemed to fade into the background as he realized the truth. The road ahead was long, but it had to start somewhere. And that somewhere, for him, had been this moment. The moment he had chosen to make a difference. He had taken the first step toward breaking free from the old ways, from the old beliefs. And though he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop now. Not when he had seen the truth, not when he had chosen to stand up for what was right. And neither would the captain. The scene slowly began to calm. The woman was escorted away, surrounded by officers who ensured she was safe and well taken care of. The officer watched as she spoke to another officer, her voice quiet but no longer frantic. She was no longer alone in her struggle. The officer had done what he could, but he knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a shift, a change that had to come from within the force, from within the system. He stood beside the captain, both men watching the aftermath unfold. The air was still heavy with the weight of the confrontation, but there was a sense of something different now. The officer felt a stirring inside him, a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just an enforcer of the law anymore. He was a part of a larger movement, a change that had to take root if things were ever going to get better. "You know," the officer said quietly, breaking the silence between them, "I never thought it would be this difficult. I thought doing what was right would just be the right thing to do. But it's so much more complicated than that." The captain turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. "It's always complicated," he replied. "That's the truth of it. Doing what's right isn't about following the rules. It's about being willing to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And it's about being willing to change. The hardest part is taking that first step." The officer nodded, his gaze still fixed on the officers around them. He could see the ripple effect of their actions, the subtle shift in the air, the quiet conversations among the other officers as they processed what had just happened. They weren't just looking at him and the captain anymore. They were looking at the system they were all a part of, and for the first time, they weren't pretending it was perfect. The backup officers who had arrived on the scene were now talking among themselves, their tones quieter, more measured. The officer could hear snippets of conversation as they discussed what had happened and what needed to be done. Some of them seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, while others were still processing it, unsure of what to think. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were talking. What mattered was that the conversation had started. One of the officers who had been part of the backup team approached the officer and the captain. She had a notebook in her hand, a stern look on her face. "I'll make sure this gets reviewed," she said, her tone professional. "You did the right thing, but we need to make sure everything is handled properly. There's no room for mistakes here." The officer didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, his mind still racing, still processing everything that had happened. He had done the right thing. He had stood up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. But the road ahead was uncertain. He knew that. He knew that nothing would change overnight. The system wasn't going to fix itself with one act of courage. But it had to start somewhere. And today, it started with him. "You're right," the officer finally said, his voice steady. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. This has to keep happening. Every time, every day. We need to change this from the inside out. The captain smiled, a proud and knowing expression crossing his face. Exactly, he said. Change doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in the small moments, the quiet decisions, the willingness to speak up when it's hard. You've started something here. And now, it's up to you to keep it going. The officer looked at him, feeling the weight of his words sink in. The captain had been right all along. Change wasn't about big, grand gestures. It was about the quiet, consistent acts of courage. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As the officer stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't the same man who had pulled over the captain earlier that day. He had learned something he could never forget. He had learned that true authority didn't come from the badge or the uniform. It came from understanding, from empathy, and from the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant going against everything you had been taught. The officer's heart was still heavy, but now, it was heavy with purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for it. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments where the truth would feel too hard to face. But he was no longer afraid of those moments. He was no longer afraid to stand up and speak out. And as the scene around them began to clear, the officer looked at the captain one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." The captain nodded, his face solemn but proud. "You did it," he said. "You took the first step. Now, keep going. And remember, you're not alone in this." As the officer watched the backup officers continue their work, he knew that this moment would be just the beginning of a much larger journey. He was ready for whatever came next, because now, he understood the truth. He understood that it wasn't enough to be a cop. He had to be something more, a protector of the truth, a defender of what was right, no matter the cost. And for the first time, he truly believed that change was possible. One step at a time. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the city. The officer stood outside the scene, watching as the first light of dawn slowly bathed the streets in warmth. It felt like a new day, not just for the city, but for him as well. The weight of the previous hours still hung on his shoulders, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like a weight he could carry. A weight he was ready to carry, because he now understood what it meant to stand up for something bigger than himself. The captain stood beside him, looking out at the city. Neither of them said anything for a while. There was nothing more to say. Change happens when people come together, when they're willing to see the truth and stand up for it, no matter what. It doesn't happen in a flash. It happens in small, consistent moments. The officer took a deep breath, the weight of everything finally settling into place. He had never thought of himself as a part of something larger. He had always believed that change happened outside of him, in someone else, in a different place, a different time. But now, he understood that he was a part of it. He was a part of a movement, no matter how small it seemed at the moment, that was changing the world, one step at a time. He looked at the captain, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything. You helped me see things I couldn't see before." The captain's smile grew, and he placed a hand on the officer's shoulder. "You did it yourself. All I did was show you the path. You took the first step. Now, keep walking." As the two of them stood there, side by side, the officer felt a renewed sense of clarity. The city around him might have seemed unchanged on the surface, but he knew it wasn't. He wasn't. He had taken that first step toward breaking the cycle. Toward breaking the system that had kept him, and so many others, locked in patterns of bias and judgment. The officer turned to the captain, his heart full of determination. "I'll keep walking," he said quietly. And I won't stop until things are better. Until we all start seeing each other as we really are." The captain gave a nod of approval. "That's the spirit," he said. "That's what it's all about. You'll inspire others. And one day, they'll inspire more. Change isn't just about one person doing the right thing. It's about creating a ripple that spreads." The officer took a step back, his chest swelling with the strength of the truth. He knew the road ahead was long. It would take years, maybe even decades, to see the full effects of what they had started. But the foundation had been laid. It had been laid in the small moments of honesty, of standing up when it was hard, of refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. It had been laid by a simple choice. One that the officer had made. And now, it was up to him to carry it forward. With the captain by his side, the officer took one last look at the scene. There was still work to be done, but that's what made the job worth doing. He had always thought that being a cop meant enforcing the law. But now, he understood. It meant much more. It meant standing up for the truth, for people, for justice. The officer knew the truth wasn't always easy to face, but he was ready to face it. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light over the city, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. The captain gave him a final, knowing look as they walked away together. The city was waiting. And they were ready to change it.